Local elections now held nearly 6 weeks ago. Mayors and speakers were elected over 2 weeks ago, and still, some of the major metros don't have mayoral committees. Currently, there are no mayoral committees in Ekhuruleni, Joburg, Tshwane, and I think Ethekwini. Professor Jaape, Visser is the director at the Dullah Omar Institute. Dr. Ntsikelelo is at the Department of History and Political Studies at Nelson Mandela University. Gentlemen, I appreciate the time. Thank you. Good afternoon to you. Professor Visser, let me start with you. Is there a time limit to elect a mayoral committee? Is there a deadline, a particular time by which time a mayor has to make these appointments?
Good afternoon, Stephen, and thanks for having me. So there is no time limit really for the appointment of mayoral committee members. Of course, there's a time limit for electing an executive mayor. That must be done within 2 weeks after the elections. But then the council has a bit of discretion, because even though it must, the executive mayor must appoint mayoral committee members, there's no time limit to it. In the case of Ethekwini, it's a bit different. They have a different system. They elect right within the first 2 weeks. They have established an executive committee. So that committee is already in place and has been elected by the council. So they work a bit differently. But in the other metros, there's still the outstanding matter of the appointment of mayoral committee members. And of course, the reason for it is that there was not really a coalition agreement underlying the arrangement that happened, because the executive mayors were elected basically on the day at that council meeting. The chips fell the way they fell, but there wasn't really a firm coalition agreement in place that spoke about issues such as how those positions were going to be divided.
So, Professor, does that mean then, could the other councillors, so the councillors from other parties, and just to be clear, it's a DA in minority administrations, I mean, they don't have majority support in Ekhuruleni, Joburg and Tshwane, sort of Tshwane is slightly different again, but could other councillors, so councillors from other parties, bring a vote on this and say you have to do it?
It's an interesting one. I don't legally, it's never happened like that before. I think the first thing that comes to mind is that the provincial government is going to exert pressure, which MEC Mayoral in Gauteng has already done, and start asking questions like, when are you going to get your house in order? But it's not completely impossible to run for a little while without mayoral committee members, because legally it's not immediately a train smash. The executive mayor is in place, and he or she exercises the executive authority. But of course, it's not good for service delivery. It's not good for efficiency and visibility, because now everything has to be orchestrated by the executive mayor, and that becomes a bottleneck. And I think there's a vacuum in political leadership on those specific portfolios that needs to be filled as soon as possible. But legally, it's a bit of a no man's land. But ultimately, I think the provincial government will start exerting pressure to see those members appointed.
Dr. Ntsikelelo, breakfast, I mean, what this really points to so long after the mayors were elected is that there's a massive political problem. They just haven't been able to form a coalition, have they?
No, they haven't, Stephen. My view is that the whole concept of power sharing is about politics of accommodation. Power sharing is about taking decisions which are based on a consensus. Power sharing is not about marginalizing other political players. We have also joined forces in constituting a particular government. So I think the challenge that we have is that some coalition partners are not trustworthy. They are not reliable. Now, when one looks at the power sharing arrangements covering the period of 2016 until, let's say, early this year, before the local government elections, those ones were not workable. They were unstable. And when one juxtaposes that with the ones that we have, I think these ones that we have are worse because of the reasons that I have cited. Now, it looks like power sharing arrangements are, a kind of government that is not good in terms of rendering services, because if mayoral committees cannot be instituted, what that does is to put the whole notion of service delivery on hold.
The other thing, Dr. Breakfast, is that, I mean, if you look at the politics of it, how these mayors were elected, in a surprise, I mean, you know, the DA's mayoral candidate for Ekhuruleni in the elections wasn't even in the chamber at the time. Someone stood in for her, Tanya Campbell, and became mayor. It was a big surprise to everybody. And you've got the DA really relying on support from the EFF and Action SA, and it doesn't want to rely on the support really from the EFF or, I suppose, Action SA. I mean, I can't see an easy solution. I don't see an easy coalition coming in these situations.
Yeah, there seems to be, Stephen, in my view, there seems to be a missing link between power sharing arrangements and some provisions of conflict management, in the sense that the political elite have a tendency to rush into joining forces by forming these coalition arrangements without developing a conflict management mechanism to deal with their own internal contradictions. So long as you don't have a formal structure or an independent body that can hold these coalition partners, you are going to have problems.
Professor Visser, I mean, at the same time, I would imagine residents are going to get frustrated. I mean, you want to know who's in charge of the roads, well, the potholes in your area, why the traffic light doesn't work. The fact is that officials will get things going along for a while, but political direction is important, and that would come from a member of the Mayoral Committee.
No, absolutely, you're right. And I think this is also an area where we actually we can also blame the law a little bit, because political parties are rushing into these coalition sort of decisions, simply because the law forces them to. I've said this 6 years ago. I said, you know, these 2 weeks deadlines, it's really problematic in the case of a coalition, because it simply takes a bit of time to put together a coalition. In Europe, they sometimes take a year or longer to put together a national coalition. Of course, we can't afford that in local government. But to force political parties to, within 2 weeks, recover from the election, mop up the confetti, find coalition partners, put together a coalition agreement, and then have an election, all of that within 2 weeks, is unrealistic. So they were forced to do it like this. So now we have the tail wagging the dog. You have executive mayors in place in one way or another. And now, after the fact, they have to put together a coalition. And I think there's also a problem in the law for requiring these meetings to be held within 2 weeks, even when there's such a diverse outcome that necessitates coalition negotiations.
I would imagine, Professor, I mean, when they were writing the law, they thought 2 weeks would be fine. They didn't want cities to go without administrations for too long, and yet it's backfired. I can imagine the argument about how long cities should have to do this could go on forever. I mean, should it be a year? Should it be 6 months? Should it be 5 years? We'll have another election. I mean, it could go on forever.
No, absolutely, and that's a scenario that, of course, we must avoid at all costs, but some sort of placeholder arrangement that keeps service delivery going while the negotiations take place, I think is called for. And also we need to revisit some of the laws and regulations pertaining to local government, and we need to think about this coalition scenario, think it through a little bit, and think of, for example, what is this independent institution that Dr. Breakfast talks about? How can we shape that? How would that work? Is there some sort of independent person, expert, mediator, arbitrator